Hello, hello. It's nice to see you here. I hope you had a great day around the National Book Festival. We were downstairs with El Tiempo Latino, and there were a lot of things to do, especially for kids. There were a lot of amazing things, amazing games, and a lot of books, of course, authors, more than 100 authors. And today we have a very special conversation. I'm Rafael Ulloa, the VP of Content for El Tiempo Latino, the largest Spanish newspaper in the Washington, D.C. region and one of the largest newspapers in Spanish in the country. And I'm here today with Kelly Lytle Hernandez. I will talk, we need to keep this conversation informal, but there's a formal part first that is introducing our guest tonight, our author. Kelly Lytle Hernandez is a professor of history, African American Studies and Urban Planning at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she holds the Thomas E. Lifka Endowed Chair in History and directs the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies. She's a 2019 MacArthur Fellowship recipient. She's the author of award-winning books, for example, Migra and City of Inmates. And she lives in LA. She's visiting from LA today. And today we're talking about her book, Bad Mexicans, Race, Empire, and Revolution in the Borderlands, and about the Mexican Revolution. So please a warm round of applause for our author today. Kelly, the first question, and we're talking about this backstage, and I love this, rebel historian. That's even the title of this conversation tonight, the rebel historian, Kelly Lytle Hernandez. And we know someone gave you that title of rebel historian, but I love it, and I think I want to discuss that. What it means for you being a rebel historian, and is this rebel historian phenomenon something new, or you want to mention some rebel historians that have make a change in our world?
Oh, sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having this conversation with me, and thank you to all of you for being here probably all day. I know I've had a wonderful day listening to all the speakers, earlier with Clint Smith here on the stage, an extraordinary conversation. So I'm looking forward for us talking a little bit more. So this title, Rebel Historian, is not something I gave myself. I believe it was NPR or The Guardian who gave me that term. And to me, what it means is being a historian who, one, is embedded in social movements. And for me, I'm really involved in the movement to end mass incarceration and immigration reform in particular, those two. But also being a rebel historian and someone who's pushing against the grain of the canon and making sure we're telling more, different stories that are fuller, more critical of the canon of the typical traditional history. And so for me, that's what being the rebel historian is, but most important, to be fully engaged with the narratives that we're telling, historically speaking, helping to advance social movements that we're engaged in on the ground. For example, my last book, City of Inmates, which tells really a BIPOC history, indigenous, Black, and non-white immigrant histories of mass incarceration. That was really important because in the movement to end mass incarceration, we have the prevailing understanding, which is absolutely right, that enslavement comes out of Jim Crow, which comes out of, or mass incarceration comes out of Jim Crow, which comes out of enslavement. Completely accurate. And it comes out of indigenous histories of colonization, of removal, of banishment, and controlling the movement and mobility of indigenous populations, and other stories around immigration control. So to get all of our narratives together, so we can stand strong together on the front lines of the movement, that's what I think helps to earn that title of rebel historian.
Definitely, and that confirms my perception that the title is a very cool title, very important title, and very relevant title. And we need a lot of rebel historians today in this world, right? So, Kelly, now let's go to the title of your newest book, the book you have with you today.
Yes.
And that many people hopefully bought it, and probably they can get it signed by you later after. Bad Mexicans. When I received the book weeks before today, so my first impression when I saw the big title in red letters in the cover, I couldn't avoid to remember Bad Hombres.
That's right.
So the phrase by ex-President Donald Trump. So was that what motivated you to get this title and more than that to write about this history?
Yes, absolutely. So I've I've carried this story with me for a very long time about the Magonistas, this group of rebel journalists and others who came to the United States in the early 20th century to incite the outbreak of the 1910 Mexican Revolution. And it's really well known in Mexico, and it's really well known among Chicano activists in particular, but the sort of broad US public is pretty unfamiliar with this story. And when you're unfamiliar with this story, you're unfamiliar with the history and legacy of Latinx organizing in the United States, of immigrant organizing in the United States, of the history of US empire and the spread of US capital and political power and how that has led to mass migrations to the United States. And also the histories of racial violence against non-white immigrants in this country. And so when Donald Trump used that rhetoric of bad hombres, he was tapping into all that history, in particular the racial violence against Mexicanos in the borderlands. But nobody really knew that, right? He was allowed to get away with this language in many ways. And so at that moment, I decided I have to write this book. That one talks about these rebel journalists, but also brings to the surface these histories of empire, of racial violence, of migration, so that people can understand exactly what he's tapping into. So there is bad hombres, right? But at the turn of the 20th century, these organizers were challenging a dictator, Porfirio Diaz in Mexico, and he used the term bad Mexicans against these people who were organizing against him. So I'm putting together these two autocrats, right, who have disparaged Mexican migrants, who have sought a better life for themselves, who have fought for a better life for themselves, and tried to name those organizers as bad hombres or bad Mexicans. So that's absolutely was the sort of immediate spark to telling this story right now.
Right, and now that you mentioned the Magonistas, and I'm pretty sure many people here are familiar with the Magonistas, with Magón. Could you tell us more about why Ricardo Flores Magón is an important figure, and who are the Magonistas? We want to know more about them. How many were them? Were they like 4 people? Were they like an army? Like, can you tell us more about the Magonistas? I think, as you mentioned, we all need to learn more about the Magonistas.
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to talk about that. So first of all, let's do a little survey, right? So hands up if you have heard the story of Ricardo Flores Magón and the Magonistas before this book. Look around. It's a few hands, right? But not enough. So by the end of today, I want all those hands to go up, right? So Ricardo Flores Magón was a journalist in Mexico City at the turn of the 20th century, and he was working with a band of friends. And they had a newspaper called Regeneración. And what they were doing in Regeneración is they were challenging that dictator in Mexico. They were saying, look, you have stripped us of our rights of democracy by taking all political power in this country. And you've also stripped us of economic power by inviting in all of these foreign investors, Europeans and Americans in particular, to buy up the Mexican land base and to build up Mexican industries in ways that led to the mass dispossession of campesinos and indigenous populations in Mexico. So they were challenging him, saying that he had turned Mexicans into the, quote, servants of foreigners, and that he had robbed Mexicans of democracy. And for doing that on the pages of Regeneración, Porfirio Diaz had them arrested multiple times, put into a really god-awful prison in Mexico City, and really they felt as though their lives were in danger, which is true. So in 1904, they fled Mexico, and they came to the United States to try to rebuild their revolution against Porfirio Diaz in Mexico. And what they do is they do rebuild their newspaper, Regeneración. They establish a political party, the Partido Liberal Mexicano, the PLM, and they establish an army. And it's an army of the dispossessed. Mexicanos who had lost their land in Mexico came to the United States as workers, as cotton pickers or ranch hands. And they were willing to fight to get their land back in Mexico. And so they do these 3 things, and they end up leading 4 armed raids into Mexico between 1906 and 1908 from Texas. Those armed raids really rattle the Diaz regime, but they also rattle the United States government. Why is that? By 1910, US citizens owned nearly a quarter of the Mexican land base, dominated key industries in Mexico, railroads, mining, and more. And it was the principal site of US foreign investment anywhere in the world. So when the Magonistas from the United States challenged the Porfirio Diaz regime, which protected US investments in Mexico, they were also challenging US capital. They were challenging the Rockefellers, who had properties in Mexico, the Guggenheims, the Dohenis, and many of the robber barons, the names that we're familiar with, either made or multiplied their millions in Mexico under the protection of Porfirio Diaz. So when these Magonistas started raiding Mexico and making it look like they might actually topple the Diaz regime, the US government began to work very closely with Porfirio Diaz to stitch together what I call a cross-border counterinsurgency campaign. The US Department of War, the US Department of Justice, the US Marshals Service, the US Postal Service, police and sheriffs across the country all got involved to try to arrest or kidnap or deport as many of these Magonistas as possible. And so the book really chronicles the story of the growth of the Magonistas movement. They're known as the Magonistas because they follow Ricardo Flores Magón. But also it tells the story of that cross-border counterinsurgency campaign that tries to suppress the Magonistas. But against all of that, the Magonistas, who are journalists, who are cotton pickers and migrant workers, they're able to incite the outbreak of the revolution from the United States. So it's a pretty extraordinary tale. It's like cinematic and it's riveting, and it's like all of these people are writing in secret code and they're living in hiding and they're fugitives, and the FBI is born in this moment to try to stop these Magonistas. We can talk about a little bit that in a moment. But they persevere, and they do incite the 1910 Mexican Revolution. So it's a pretty extraordinary story. It also becomes one way that we can enter into Mexican-American history, which is so poorly known in the United States. It's really shunted to the sidelines, certainly not in the heart of the US mainstream story. But by telling the story of the Magonistas, of the people who joined their movement, of the reason why so many Mexicans were coming to the United States in the early 20th century, we're able to head right into the heart of US history. So that's who they are. They really should be taught as part of the canon of the US story, and I'm hoping this book helps us to get there.
How many were them? There's numbers, an idea of the numbers in the ranks of the Magonistas?
That's a good question, right? Because they're living in hiding, they're working as fugitives, so we're not totally sure how many there were. But we can tell by Generación, their newspaper, they had 20 to 30,000 subscribers to that newspaper, most of them living in the borderlands. And they had 40 focos, or cells, across the borderlands in particular. And their army had, hundreds, if not thousands, of people who were armed and ready to raid Mexico between those years of 1906 to 1908.
Great. So there are two things I want to talk about now. One is the FBI, and the other one is the role of the media. So why don't we start with the FBI? Because that's one of the wow factors of the book, right? Mm-hmm. People are reading, and there's this connection with what we know, like in E Street and 10, I think, where is the FBI building, what we know of the FBI today. There's a connection about how the FBI was born due to this government surveillance that happened in that time for the purpose of helping Porfirio to catch the Magonistas or to end the Magonistas. Can you tell us more about that, Kelly?
Yeah, absolutely, right. So is there a more iconic police force in the United States other than the FBI? I mean, maybe the LAPD and the NYPD and the Border Patrols. We have a lot of police forces, right? And we're working on that. But the FBI is certainly at the center of that. And so in June of 1908, the Magonistas launched their most deadly set of raids on Mexico from Texas. And believe it or not, they are coordinated from the Los Angeles County Jail, where Ricardo Flores Magón was being held in solitary confinement. And so the US government thought that the problem of the Magonistas was over. But the women of the movement were smuggling correspondence to and from Ricardo Flores Magón in solitary confinement. How did they do that? They showed up at the jail and they said, I'm just a woman. I'm here to wash his clothes. All right, so let me pick up his dirty clothes and I'll bring him some clean stuff at the end of the week. Well, he was sewing rebel correspondence into his dirty underwear and his dirty pants. His wife would pick up his clothes, take that correspondence out of the seams, and sew more rebel correspondence into the seams. And this way, Ricardo Flores Magón from LA County Jail was able to stay completely embedded in the movement that he was helping to grow. And in June of 1908, part of his battle plans are smuggled out of the LA County Jail, and the PLM army raids Mexico. Dozens of people on both sides of the raid are killed. And this is really one of the most climatic moments of the Magonistas uprising. These raids happened between about June 25th and June 30th of 1908. Right at this moment, Teddy Roosevelt and the US Attorney General are putting together a new police force to enforce federal law across the American West, around land laws in particular. But as soon as those raids happen in Mexico, they pivot. And they take this new police force in the Department of Justice, they call it the Bureau of Investigation, and they assign about a third of those agents to shutting down the Magonistas uprising. So it's an extraordinary moment with the birth of the FBI. One of their very first big cases is to try to stop the outbreak of the 1910 Mexican Revolution. And so the rise of counterinsurgency in the United States, the FBI becomes that super force, right? You go from the labor wars of after World War I to the Black Power movement, American Indian movement. The FBI is at the center of all that. The FBI cuts its teeth in counterinsurgency in trying to suppress the Magonistas. So again, this is another example. When you open up the gates and the doors and the curtains, we find that Mexico, Mexicans, and Mexican Americans are at the center of the American story, but we haven't been telling the story that way. So this book is just one way in to understanding the fullness of U.S. history.
That's right, and I was asking you also if they haven't made a movie about this, because the way, especially the way you wrote your book is very cinematic, takes you through this history. You can imagine this like in a film. So any film producer around there, like where to talk with. One other thing, like the media. Let's talk about the media. And we connected right away. I come from El Tiempo Latino, where the largest Spanish newspaper, our mission from our plan from now into 5 years is to becoming the paper of record for the Hispanics in the U.S. So we are working hard for that, and we know the importance of informing our community in Spanish. So they take informed decisions, they have knowledge, and they can progress. So the Magonistas were journalists. That time, they were the Twitter, the Facebook, everything in a print paper that people subscribed and people got information through. I want you to emphasize how important was the role of the media, both like their media and the media also that were sanctioned by the government. Like how were the roles of the different papers in those times, and what do you think is the role of the media today, in your opinion?
That's a big question, right? So the Magonistas are really important because in Mexico, you have a series of state-sanctioned newspapers that are telling the regime's story, right? And they put together their little rebel outlet there in Mexico City, telling stories like this. They told stories about women and girls who were being subjected to sexual assault across the country. Part of the Diaz regime was that he handed over political control to local jefes, right, jefes políticos. And he didn't pay them a lot, but he allowed the jefes políticos to tax people so that they could raise money for themselves and for the community. He allowed the jefes políticos also a kind of rapacious autonomy, especially with women and girls. And so there were families across Mexico who had a story about jefes políticos locally assaulting members of their family, themselves or members of their family. But it felt very local, it felt very personal, right? And what Regeneración is doing is they're telling a story in Jalisco, they're telling a story in Sonora, they're telling a story in Oaxaca, and people are reading this across the country, and a narrative is coming together about the corruption of the Diaz regime, which means more than just local change. It needs national change, and it needs to go right to the core of it all, which is Porfirio Diaz. So that's why this newspaper is so important. It's about pulling together a political community, right, by sharing our stories of what's happening under the Diaz regime. So that's key in that moment. And of course, I think you're probably the one to tell us what journalism is doing today to help tell community stories and community histories. I'll give one example. In the last 20 years, I think we've come to understand policing quite differently in this country by listening to most impacted communities, from Black folks in particular, about what are the experiences with local police and telling those stories across the country, from LA to Detroit to DC, St. Louis, everywhere, that we've come to change the narrative about what policing means to public safety and to who in this country. And that helps us, and journalists are doing a good part of that story, often by working with activists and organizers on the ground to help us change our thinking, which then can help us change policy and law and change the conditions of life for us. So I think that that's part of the power of journalism. They were doing it then, and they're doing it now.
Of course, and just answering to your question, like for example, I want to touch, because will be my next topic, immigration. So I think the paper, especially Latino and other papers from different minorities, we're doing a very hard job, but a very necessary job to help the immigrant population arrive into this country, and to also like help people understand the role of the immigrants, and giving a real picture of what the immigrants coming to this country are doing. And immigration, that is my next question. Like you mentioned in the book that basically the U.S. started the mass migration from Mexicans to this country.
That's right.
So tell us more about that. That's something, that's another wow factor, I think, of the book. We had FBI, we had that factor too. People were like, wow, I didn't know this. Like, let me read more. So can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So Mexico, 19th century Mexico was a pretty sedentary, rural nation. And it's really with the arrival of foreign investors who come in the late 19th century with the invitation of Porfirio Diaz. They start building railroads, they start buying up land, displacing people from the land, and turning them into wage laborers instead of subsistence farmers. And it's that transition which is key, because people first migrate within Mexico looking for work, and then as they're building those railroads, right, to the United States, they're jumping on those railroads and they're coming to the United States in search of higher wages. They're also coming at the invitation of US labor brokers who are going down into Mexico and putting out advertisements, come north, come north, come north. And so the expansion of US economic empire, right, that leads to the dislocation of the Mexican population, and folks are being invited into the United States, and that's really the beginning of mass labor migration from Mexico to the United States, is in that moment. And that's really key to think about, because we often talk about immigration stories as individual family stories. A person made a decision, right, to come to the United States. But there are deep structures that are in place that confine somebody's options in terms of where they're going to go. There are processes that are put into place that direct them in to certain areas. So those railroads were key throughout the 20th century and they were all cut north and south, right, to get those products out of Mexico up to the United States. Well, it also brought people. And so the migration stories are also structural stories, are historic stories, and to understand why so many Mexicans came to the United States across the course of the 20th century, to the degree of profoundly changing US demographics, right? Within 10 or 20 years, the Latino population driven by Mexicans are going to be one of the primary populations in the United States. At this point, more Mexicans have immigrated to the United States than any other national community in US history. This is a font of the US demographic population, and we need to understand why folks came, what are the conditions that they came under, and what kind of impact their arrival has had, but also what kind of reception they were given, right? So this is part of the book, is that as Mexicanos were coming to the United States in the early 20th century, the reception varied, okay? Some folks came and they were accepted as middle class, white folks right into, the core of US society. But many folks were received as non-white immigrants. We're not quite sure what to do with them. They're not white, but they're not black. What are we going to do with them? And they were subjected to high levels of segregation in the workforce, segregation in housing and communities, and extraordinary high levels of racial violence as well. So this book opens with one of those stories of racial violence, with the lynching that occurred in November of 1910, to ground us in that history of race and migration that is so central to US history and to the Magonistas story. So that's where all it comes from.
And then you have, like today, still people, coming for same reasons in a way, like, the violence in Central America. and they come through Mexico. So they have like several ordeals they need to go through, like from the South American or Haiti through the jungle of Darien all the way to Mexico, then to try to cross the border to the U.S. So those stories are still here today. And Kelly, you just mentioned something that really shocked me was reading like some of the phrases that you were saying, like people were saying in those times about Mexican people. Like I remember one of the robber barons saying something awful. You mentioned him in the book, but the one I have here is a farmer's publication in California that probably you had a lot of migrant workers working in agriculture in California in that time and today. Say Mexicans are plentiful, generally peaceable, and satisfied with very low social conditions. So those kind of things were terrible. And you think like some of those speeches are still around today, and probably we don't hear much about them, but you think are very present?
Absolutely, right? So there's different code words that are used today that we don't use exactly the same language. Even the title of this book, Bad Mexicans, is provocative because what is embedded in many notions of a Mexican, right, in this country. And I'll be honest, there are members of my own family, my extended family, who were very upset with the title. It felt to them as though this term, not just bad Mexicans, but Mexicans, has been so derisive. Like you across time, you dirty Mexican, right? Or you Mexican, the Mexicans over there. And in some ways, I wanted to take it head on, right? Of how much the notions and ideas and perceptions and lies about who Mexicanos are has been written into just the name Mexican, right? And to unpack all of that and where those ideas come from. And it comes from the farmers, right? It comes from the investors. It comes from local residents across the borderlands in particular. And that's very much with us today. So when Trump said something like bad hombres, he was able to dismiss it and say, no, it doesn't really mean what you think it means, but we know it means what it means, right? So one of the things about this book that I wanted to make sure we got to is that there is a moment at the end of this book where a group of Texas Rangers and deputized residents of Texas are sent out to suppress the last whisper of the Magonistas movement in the summer of 1915. And the way that they do it is they create lists of bad Mexicans, and they go hunting across South Texas. And they murder anywhere between 300 and some people say 5,000 Mexicanos across southern Texas. That is a history of racial violence and massacre that almost no one in this country knows about. And if you don't know about that history of racial violence that is targeting Mexicans in particular, you don't understand what that language means today. So we've got to start telling these histories to understand the way that non-white Latinx immigrants are being received in this country, and when code language is being used, what it actually is summoning. And it's summoning a deep history of violence, of segregation, of empire. And so these kinds of histories, I think, are really key to doing the work that you're mentioning.
Thank you, Kelly. And I would like to know we're talking about like some reactions that people in the audience have had with your book when you have given lectures and presentations. I would like to know more about that. Do you have any anecdotes of any meaningful interaction with the audience, especially with Mexican American crowd? You are in LA with big Mexican American population. So could you tell us some anecdotes of interactions and interesting reactions from the audience?
Yeah. So, when a book comes out, there are a lot of different audiences that you can speak to. I've spoken to many about this book. One of my priorities is to make sure I'm getting out into community and talking to the groups whose are most direct, the legacy impacts the most directly, which is Mexicano communities, Chicano communities. And when I do book talks that is mostly a Latino crowd, almost the first question that comes begins with tears. It's just the sensibility of feeling seen, right? For many people, They often say, you know, my grandfather came here, my grandmother came here, but I never knew why. And I've always felt adrift because of that, but now I understand my family history, my family story, and how it connects to the broader fabric of the American experience. And so those are really powerful conversations. They're also powerful because the Magonista story makes Latinx protagonists the center of US history, that they are the ones powering the story. They're turning the page of history, that Teddy Roosevelt had to contend with their dreams and their demands. That is extraordinary, right? To feel yourself at the center of history. And for many Latinx youth, they're not seeing that, they're not feeling it in the textbooks, in the curriculum, in the popular culture. And so one of my greatest hopes for the book, and one of the things that we're seeing, is that it's empowering, it's emancipatory to feel that you're part of a community who has changed history. Not just in Mexico, which is significant enough, right? But right here in the United States and around the world. And so I hope that this book is like a gateway book, right, to understanding more of those stories, and that people, if you didn't know about the Magonistas and how they shaped the American story, what else did you not know? What more books do people need to be reading and writing so we can better understand the American story? So those are some of the reactions that we've been getting to this book, and I'm hoping that it's just the beginning.
Great, and I think there are like a lot of sources to continue reading about the topic, right? I just found that there is a whole archive of Magón writings.
Yes. So if you want to see the writings of Ricardo Flores Magón, there's this wonderful archive created by a Mexican scholar, Jacinto Barrera Basols. It's called archivomagon.net, and he's made all of his writings publicly available there. You also can check out the tattoo on my arm, because the Magonistas used to write in secret code. And one of the terms that they brought to the Mexican Revolution is tierra y libertad, land and liberty. Y'all heard about that in the Mexican Revolution? The Magonistas brought that anarchist battle cry to the Mexican Revolution. And so my son and I have matching tattoos of tierra y libertad on our arms. And we did it in secret code because when the Magonistas were being chased by the US Postal Service, and they were allowing the Mexican agents to open up their mail and track them down across the country, the Magonistas began to write in secret code so that the US government and the Mexican government couldn't figure out what they were saying or where their next attack would come from. And so we've taken that secret code and we've put it on our bodies to carry the Magonistas with us everywhere.
That's great. Mm-hmm. And we got the 15 minutes warning, so we want to make mindful with the audience if there are any questions. We also want to leave some room for questions. I'm pretty sure we have some members of the audience who would like to ask you something. There are microphones on the sides. So if you have questions, like we can talk more hours and hours, but like I want to see if people want to ask something. Like we have one question over there.
Yes, Gil, I'd like to know if the Magonistas had a specific program to deal with the great investment in Mexico. Did they have some ideas about how they wanted to oppose that? Redistributing land reform agraria, something like that? Or was it just opposed to the dictatorship of Diaz?
Great question. So yes, the Magonistas basically crowdsourced a program that they published in 1906. They wanted labor right, a minimum wage, they wanted health insurance, they wanted land rights returned to rural and indigenous communities, so lands actually returned to those communities. They wanted restrictions on foreign investors and investments in Mexico. It's about a 52-point plan, so I won't go through all of them right now. But one of the things that's really important is the Magonistas don't go on to become major generals in the Mexican Revolution. You know, Emiliano Zapata, Pancho Villa, the names that you're all familiar with, the Magonistas do not become those folks. But their ideas, right, especially about economic liberation for Mexicans, those do carry forward, and many of them become part of the 1917 Mexican Constitution. So yes, they do develop a program.
I had a question.
We have one here first.
I think I was up.
Oh, then.
Come on, sis.
Please.
So yeah, hey Kelly, it's Nicole with the Sentencing Project. Nice to see you.
Hey, it's good to see you.
So my question was about your story with the Texas Rangers and whether or not there's a movement or an effort to try to get that agency to acknowledge the state violence that you recount in your book and that you shared here today? Is there any effort around that?
I'm unaware of a direct effort to have the Texas Rangers acknowledge their history of racial violence. There may be one. However, there is a historical project, which I strongly recommend for everyone. It's called Refusing to Forget, and they have a website that everybody can check out. And Refusing to Forget is documenting the history of lynchings in the United States that target Mexicans in particular, many of which involve the Texas Rangers, either actively participating or turning the other way. So I would recommend looking at Refusing to Forget, I think it's .org, to learn more about that history of beginning to tell the stories. A lot of people don't know that Texas Rangers story. There's the strong mythology and there's the actual archival history of who they were. And I think a movement is building out of that work. It's a great question.
Buenos dias. I wanted to ask you about Octavio Paz, Labyrinth of Solitude, which is a book that many Americans will come across first in this current learning about Mexico or Mexican attitudes or Mexicanness, and how that, if there's any connection to, is that a reactionary book in your view in terms of the Magonista? This is a new history for me. I'm trying to understand whether that book is still relevant in terms of understanding something about Mexican identity, or in your view, and how it's connected to this history, if it is at all.
That's a good question. So Labyrinth of Solitude by Octavio Paz, one of the things that it does is it talks about sort of the in-betweenness of Mexican identity. Off the top of my head, I'm not seeing the connection with the Magonistas. I will say that one of the emerging trends in Latino studies that is very exciting is a new reckoning with race within the story, in particular anti-Blackness, and the ways in which indigenous histories need to come to the fore. So Octavio Paz is talking more about mestizo identities, right? And I think in the next 10 to 20 years, maybe even less, we're going to see more of a reckoning with the histories of the transatlantic slave trade and settler colonialism and colonization in Latin America, and the ways that it created different racial hierarchies that transcend and confront the mestizo identity that he's talking about. So I don't know off the top of my head about the Magonistas in the past, but I think there's a generation of scholarship that's going to come that's going to be a conversation of sorts with Octavio Paz that's going to be really interesting. Thank you. Yeah.
One question?
Hi, Kelly. Some of the economic reforms after the revolution was the expulsion of multinationals, including energy companies. And it led to, there was some liberalization about a decade ago or so, and now the current Mexican president is reviving that tradition. Can you talk a little bit about that and that Mexican tradition, especially of that domestic energy sector?
Yeah, well, so it's domestic energy, it's subsoil rights. I mean, so the Magonistas, one part of their 52-point plan is to retain subsoil rights, which does get written to the 1917 Constitution and has been struggled over ever since, right, with shifting political trends. At this moment, kind of moving back to the nationalization of many of those rights. I guess what I would say to that, to bring us back to the book in particular, is there are different people who are fighting for the removal of Porfirio Diaz from office. There are some people who want strictly political reform. The person who goes on to be the first president of Mexico after Porfirio Diaz, Francisco Madero, which is maybe a name that you're familiar with, was much more about political reform. And what's so important about the Magonistas is they're coming from a socialist, a Marxist, and an anarchist background in which they're advancing very strong economic ideas around economic reform. And so they're the ones that push into that constitution these ideas about labor rights, about land rights, and about economic reform that people are still battling over right up to this moment. And of course, today's President AMLO, if you see him give his news conferences, whose picture do you see right behind him? Ricardo Flores Magón, right? Because Ricardo Flores Magón is this intellectual giant who helped Mexico, or helped to inject these ideas of economic reform into Mexico. Also, he died 100 years ago in 1922 in Leavenworth Prison here in the United States. So Mexico has declared 2022, 100 years since his death, to be the year of Ricardo Flores Magón. So one of the ways they're celebrating him is telling his story, and his image is right there behind the president every morning.
I have one question here.
Could you elaborate a little bit on the Magonista raids themselves? Were they confined to the border? What kind of targets were they going after? And did Mexicans in Mexico themselves participate as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are 4 raids between 1906 and 1908. Most of them are relatively small. The first one is on the small town of Jimenez, Mexico. And it's not the size or scale of them, it's the daringness that anyone would even try, right? Because Porfirio Diaz has his army, but he also has this rural police force known as Rurales, who would track people down and shoot them in the back, right? Tens of thousands of people were murdered at this style, Le Buga, in Mexico. So it's that that's so important about the raids. There are 3 more that happened, like I said, in June of 1908. And those are pretty dramatic. One of them in Las Vacas leads to the killing of several dozen people. And it does involve the local community. So some people come across from Texas. Some people come from the surrounding community area. Often even, the border is pretty open in this time period. One of the things to remember about this is before any border wall, this is before the Border Patrol. There's really a moment when the U.S. isn't even monitoring Mexican immigration at all. At all. It's not until 1907, 1908 the U.S. government even tries to count the number of Mexicans entering the country. If you were Mexican, they went, yeah, come on through. We need workers, right? They really were focused on Chinese immigrants through Chinese exclusion during this time period. So a lot of those Mexicans who were disgruntled in northern Mexico would come north of the border to plan the raids and to gather up guns, to gather up horses, back on Las Vacas, Palomas, Viesca, and Jimenez. Those are the 4 towns that get raided. So those are the stories of the raids on Mexico. And they're a pretty extraordinary history that rocks the world. It's really great, and then you get these fathers and sons who are part of invading armies. Their families have been dislocated or dispossessed from local ranchos or communities, and they say, well, we better join this army if we ever want to get our land back, right? You have women who are gathering up the guns, putting them in baby carriages and taking them down to the border, saying, that's just my baby, don't look, right? And smuggling guns into Mexico for the raids. You have people who had served in the army when Porfirio Diaz came in, but at a certain point he downsizes the army and lose their jobs. They have all this military experience, but they get removed from their title, they get removed from their land, and they're pissed, right? And so they join the Magonistas, and they help to coordinate these raids to give them some structure. All these people are in the mix that lead to these raids on Diaz's Mexico, and they're these just extraordinary moments. And the raids are really important, but it's also the ripple effect of what happens from them. It's just the fact that someone would challenge Porfirio Diaz in this way. Porfirio Diaz is a legendary military general in Mexico. He played a key role in the Battle of Puebla, which is the one that we celebrate today, called Cinco de Mayo, in which Mexican forces really repel the French from invading Mexico City. He played a key role in that battle. He had a tactical, strategic mind. So the idea that these migrant workers and cotton pickers would get together and try to challenge Porfirio Diaz was like, what? And they did it, right? And it rattles the world because so many people have investments in Mexico. And it really helps to embolden many more people who come to the fight in 1910. So even though the Magonistas really don't fight much during the revolution, they play a key role in emboldening the nation to armed revolt.
Thank you so much for your questions to everyone who participated. And thank you so much, Kelly. It was a wonderful conversation. I love your book. I learned a lot. So please, a round of applause for Kelly Lytle Hernandez.